There is a version of you that has never told the truth, not because you are dishonest, but because you learned very early that the truth about who you are was not entirely welcome here. So you built something, a version, carefully, quietly, over years. You assembled it piece by piece. The right tone of voice, the appropriate emotional temperature, the correct amount of ambition to display, and the correct amount to conceal. You learned when to laugh and when to soften. You learned which parts of yourself made rooms comfortable and which parts made rooms go silent. And the world rewarded you for this. That was the trap. Every reward reinforced the construction. Every approval was another brick. Every "you're so strong" or "you're so calm" or "I don't know what we'd do without you" was another layer over the thing that was actually living. Underneath, Carl Jung gave this construction a name. He called it the persona. The word comes from Latin. The masks worn by actors in ancient theater, not metaphorically, literally. A carved face hollow at the back designed to project one character to an audience that would never see the actor's real face at all. Jung looked at modern human beings and saw same theater, the same hollow masks, the same audience applause, and the same devastating loneliness of the performer who has forgotten after years on stage what their actual face looks like. This is not a video about becoming more authentic in a vague, inspirational sense. This is psychological excavation, a precise Jungian mapping of what happens to a human being when the mask they built to survive the world slowly, almost imperceptibly begins to consume the life it was meant to protect. If you have spent years being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who holds everything together while something in you quietly dissolves, stay with this. It was written for you. Like and subscribe. A new descent into Jung's world arrives here every single day. You already know something is wrong. Not wrong in a way that shows. You function. You perform your role with such fluency that most people around you would be genuinely shocked to learn that inside the person they depend on there is something exhausted beyond words. Something that has been performing for so long it no longer remembers the difference between the performance and the person. You wake in the morning and before your eyes have fully opened, the construction begins. Before your feet touch the floor, you are already assembling today's version. You know who will need what from you. You know what face to wear to which conversation. You know precisely how much of yourself you are permitted to bring into any given room and how much must be left outside standing in the cold. This is not weakness. Do not mistake it for weakness. This is intelligence that was once survival. You learned these adaptations because at some point, perhaps in a childhood where emotional authenticity was dangerous, perhaps in a marriage where your real feelings were too inconvenient, perhaps in a career where the person you actually were did not match the person you needed to be, you learned that the mask worked. It kept you safe. It earned you love or something close enough to love that you stopped examining the difference. But Jung understood something the mask never tells you, that there is a cost. There is always a cost. The psyche does not forget what it has been asked to suppress. It does not simply absorb the weight of every repressed truth and carry it silently forever. It stores it. It builds it. And eventually, through the body, through dreams, through the sudden and inexplicable collapse of a life that looked from the outside entirely intact, it returns. Jung did not discover the persona as an abstraction. He observed it in consulting rooms in Zurich in the early decades of the 20th century, where patient after patient arrived, presenting not with their actual suffering, but with the socially acceptable version of their suffering. They had learned to package even their pain into something palatable, something that would not disturb, something the world could receive without discomfort. He saw professors who had reduced themselves entirely to their academic function, mothers who had erased them so completely into the role of caretaker that when their children left and the role dissolved, there was nothing behind it. Men who had worn the mask of strength for so many decades that when grief finally arrived, they had no interior architecture capable of holding it. The persona, he wrote, is a functional complex. It exists for a reason. It is the necessary interface between the inner world and the social world. Without some version of it, we could not navigate civilization at all. The child who has not yet learned to modulate emotional expression, the adult who has never developed any social face, these are not liberated souls. They are simply people without the tool. The problem is not the mask. The problem is what happens when the mask is never removed. When the performance becomes so continuous, so practiced, so deeply rewarded that the wearer forgets there was ever anything behind it. When the persona stops being a tool and starts being an identity. When you no longer wear the mask. When the mask wears you. Jung described a specific psychological phenomenon that emerges at this point. He called it inflation of the persona. The ego begins to identify completely with the social role. The professor becomes only a professor. The devoted spouse becomes only a spouse. The successful executive becomes only the success. And in that becoming, something critical is foreclosed. The deeper layers of the psyche, the unacceptable truths, the unlived life, all of it is sealed off behind the smooth surface of the role, and sealed does not mean gone. There is something Jung called the shadow. If the persona is everything you show the world, then the shadow is everything you have refused to show anyone, including yourself. It is not merely the dark impulses, the aggression, the jealousy, the hunger, though those are there. The shadow contains something more disturbing than evil. It contains everything you were told was unacceptable, and that includes qualities that are not dark at all. Creativity that was called impractical, ambition that was called selfish, grief that was called self-indulgent, joy that was called embarrassing. The child who was too loud, too sensitive, too strange, too much of something, the family system could not accommodate. All of that was placed into the shadow. And here is the mechanism that makes this so consequential. The stronger the persona, the larger the shadow. They grow in proportion to each other. Every additional layer you place over yourself in the name of acceptabilities adds an equal weight to what is being buried. Jung wrote that the shadow is the sum of all personal and collective psychic elements, which, because of their incompatibility with the chosen conscious attitude, are denied expression in life. Denied expression, not destroyed, not dissolved, denied. The denied material does not disappear. It accumulates pressure. It seeks outlets. It emerges in the people you find most irritating, because what you cannot tolerate in others is almost always what you cannot tolerate in yourself. It appears in your dreams. Jung noted that the figure who most disturbs you in a dream most challenges, or frightens, or enrages you is frequently the shadow presenting itself for recognition. It erupts in moments of stress, when the persona's grip loosens and something raw and unmanageable surfaces briefly before being forced back down with shame, and it slowly poisons the interior life. A human being who has constructed an enormous persona and buried an equally enormous shadow is not a well-defended person. They are a pressurized system. They are a structure that looks solid from outside and is being hollowed from within. The collapse when it comes does not feel like growth. It feels like destruction. Jung knew this. He called the first movement of genuine psychological transformation the Negrido, the blackening, the alchemical stage in which what was false is not gently released but violently dissolved. the old structure must actually break. Not symbolically, actually. The marriage that was built on persona to persona performance rather than soul to soul recognition. The career that expressed the role and starved the real self. The identity that was constructed for the world and abandoned the person who lived inside it. The negrito is the moment the mask cracks, and for those living through it from the inside, it feels indistinguishable from ruin. This is where Jung diverged most radically from the psychology of his time, and perhaps from the psychology of any time. He did not regard the collapse of the persona as a breakdown. He regarded it as an initiation. He had studied with the precision of a scientist and the sensitivity of a poet the mythologies of cultures across the entire span of human history. And what he found everywhere, without exception, was this. The hero does not become the hero in the comfort of the known world. The transformation happens in what Joseph Campbell would later call the belly of the whale, the descent into darkness, the dissolution of the old self, the period of not knowing who you are or what your life means. Jung saw this mythological pattern as a map of an interior process. The persona cracking is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of it, the true beginning. Because what lies beneath the persona once the protective layers are stripped away is not emptiness. It is the self. The term Jung's used not for the soul's personality, but for the totality of the psyche, including all that was never permitted, expression. The self is older than the personas. It was there before the world told you who to be. It is the part of you that remembers what the mask was designed to hide. And when the persona cracks and the negrito descends, the self begins for the first time to genuinely speak. Most people do not recognize this voice. Having spent decades listening only to the voice that the world rewarded, they experience the self's first communications as symptoms, as depression, as anxiety, as the strange restlessness that settles over a successful life and refuses to explain itself. Jung wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, meaning that when we refuse to consciously engage with the pain of our genuine psychological situation, the psyche will manufacture unconscious suffering instead. The body aches without medical cause. Sleep becomes strange and populated with disturbing imagery. Relationships that once seemed stable become suddenly unbearable. The performance that once required effort now feels physically impossible. These are not signs of weakness. These are the self's insistence on being heard. There is a dream image Jung returned to repeatedly in his clinical notes and in his own recorded dreams. The image of the double, the uncanny figure who looks like you, but is not you, who stands across from you in the dream landscape with your face but different eyes, eyes that know something. In Jungian dream analysis, the double is one of the most significant symbols the psyche can produce. It represents the emergence of the shadow into potential consciousness. The psyche presenting to the dreamer what has been refused acknowledgement, the part of you that has been locked behind the persona, now finding a way to appear. When this figure appears in dreams, Jung did not advise the dreamer to run from it or to interpret it as a threat. He advised engagement. The practice he called active imagination, a disciplined form of interior dialogue in which the conscious mind makes contact with the figures, emerging from the unconscious, and enters into genuine conversation with them. Not to absorb them uncritically, not to unleash the shadow's contents into waking life without discernment, but to hear what they carry, to understand what the denied parts of the self have been holding. To begin the process of integration, because the integration of the shadow is not the same as becoming darker. It is the process of becoming whole. The person who has integrated their shadow does not suddenly act out their aggression or abandon their moral commitments. They become more real, more fully present, more honest, in a way that is felt by everyone in their vicinity because they are no longer managing a performance. The energy that was consumed in maintaining the mask becomes available for actual living. They become capable of what Jung considered the highest psychological achievement available to a human being. He called it individuation. Individuation is the word Jung used for the lifelong process of becoming the unique individual you actually are, as distinct from the social role you have been performing. It is not a destination, it is a direction, a continuous movement toward greater wholeness, toward the progressive integration of all the elements of the psyche, split off, denied, or projected outward. It requires the persona to be understood as a tool and not a self. Requires the shadow to be met and not evaded. It requires the anima or animus, the interior feminine or masculine principle, to be recognized as a genuine force within the psyche rather than projected entirely onto external relationships. And it requires an encounter with what Jung called the self with a capital S, the organizing center of the total psyche, the archetype of wholeness. This is not a gentle process. Jung was entirely clear about this. Individuation is the most demanding undertaking a human being can enter, not because it requires great external achievement, but because it requires the willingness to see yourself as you actually are, to sit with the knowledge that the person you have been presenting to the world for years or decades is not the whole story, that there are unlived dimensions, suppressed truths, foreclosed possibilities, and to choose not to look away. Most people never begin this process, not because they lack the intelligence or the depth, but because the persona offers a very convincing alternative. The mask works. It receives rewards. It is legible to the world in ways the authentic self often is not. And choosing the mask over and over is not a moral failure. It is a completely understandable response to a world that consistently rewards performance over presence. But the psyche keeps the account. Every time the authentic response was swallowed and the appropriate one performed instead. Every time you said you were fine when you were fracturing. Every time you smiled at something that diminished you. Every time you made yourself smaller so someone else could feel larger, the psyche recorded it, not with judgment, but with accumulating weight. And that weight eventually becomes impossible to carry without cost. There is a type of person Jung encountered again and again in the second half of life who arrives at a moment of profound disorientation. They have by every external measure succeeded. They have built what they were supposed to build. They have become who they were supposed to become. And they stand in the middle of it feeling nothing, or worse than nothing, feeling a specific variety of grief that has no socially acceptable name because it is the grief not of losing what you love, but of realizing that what you built was never quite yours, that the life belongs to the persona. And the person who actually exists underneath the persona has been waiting in the dark for decades. Jung saw this not as a crisis to be resolved, but as an opportunity to be entered. The second half of life, he believed, must have a different psychological task than the first. The first half is oriented outward, building the structures, establishing the role, acquiring the persona that will allow you to function in the world. These are necessary achievements, but the second half demands a turning inward, a willingness to question what was constructed, to ask not what the world needs from me, but what my own soul has been trying to say beneath all the noise of the performance. This turning is not automatic. It does not happen simply because you have reached a certain age or accumulated certain losses. It requires a willingness that is genuinely rare. The willingness to be uncomfortable with yourself, to sit in the negrito and not immediately reach for a solution, to let the dissolution proceed without forcing a premature reconstruction. Most people, when the persona begins to crack, reach immediately for a new persona, a spiritual identity that replaces the professional one, a different relationship that recreates the same unconscious patterns with different faces, a new project that keeps the hands busy and the inner voice drowned out. Jung watched this happen with great sadness, because what was being refused was not suffering. What was being refused was transformation. The alchemical framework that Jung spent the later decades of his life developing was not a mystical indulgence. It was a precise psychological map. The ancient alchemists who attempted to transform base metals into gold were, according to Jung, projecting onto matter the interior's process of the psyche's own transformation, the language they used. Nigredo, albedo, rubedo, blackening, whitening, reddening, was the language of what happens to a human soul when it stops performing and begins to be refined. The nigredo is the period you may already be living, the collapse of the old identity, the darkness that follows the dissolution of what was false, the terror of not knowing who you are when the role is removed. This is not pathology. This is the beginning of the alchemical work, the base material being broken down so that something more genuine can be extracted from it. The albedo follows, the whitening, a period of greater clarity, of beginning to see what was always there beneath the performance, of recognizing the shadow not as an enemy, but as a carrier of what was lost. This is the phase in which dreams often shift. The disturbing figures begin to carry gifts. The dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious becomes less combative and more generative. The rubedo is the completion, the reddening, the integration of what was divided. The persona returned to its proper function as a tool rather than an identity. The shadow acknowledged, integrated, made conscious. The self recognized not as an ideal to be achieved, but as a living reality to be inhabited. Very few people reach the rubedo, not because it is beyond them, but because the albedo requires a quality of interior courage that the persona was specifically designed to make unnecessary. The persona is an avoidance of the interior. It faces outward by definition. To enter the albedo, you must be willing to face inward, to be present to what is actually there rather than to what is acceptable. This is the demand individuation makes. It will not negotiate. Jung wrote in a passage that has stayed with readers across a century that what you do not make conscious will appear in your life as fate. Read that again. What you do not make conscious will appear in your life as fate, the shadow you refuse to acknowledge, the authentic self you continue to bury beneath the persona, the grief that was never allowed its proper expression, the rage that was too inconvenient, the tenderness that was too vulnerable. These do not simply wait politely for you to be ready. They organize your external circumstances without your awareness. They drive you toward the same relationships over and over, not because you are unlucky, but because something in the unconscious is trying to present you with the same unresolved material, until you are finally willing to look at it directly. The spouse who eventually cannot tolerate your inauthenticity, the career that collapses precisely at the moment when continuing, it would have required one more decade of self-betrayal. The body that refuses to carry forward what the psyche has been forced to carry alone. These are not accidents. They are the unconscious organizing your outer life to match your inner truth, whether you cooperate or not. This is why Jung considered the unlived life to be one of the most dangerous forces a human being could carry, not because living authentically is always safe or comfortable or socially rewarded, but because the alternative is a life increasingly organized by forces you have refused to acknowledge, a life that happens to you rather than through you, a series of events that feel like fate but are actually the accumulated weight of everything you refused to become. The archetype that most precisely maps this experience is what mythologists and Jung himself understood as the twice born. It appears across cultures, across centuries, ac- across every significant spiritual and psychological tradition humanity has produced. The figure who lives a first life defined by social identity performance and external achievement, who then undergoes a death of some kind, a dissolution, the loss of the first life's organizing structure, and who emerges from that dissolution not merely recovered but fundamentally different, carrying something that the first life could not have produced. The twice born is not a metaphor for resilience. It is not the story of someone who suffered and bounced back. It is specifically the story of someone who allowed the first identity to actually die and did not immediately replace it with another performance, who sat in the darkness between the two lives long enough for something genuine to be born in that space. This is what the persona's dissolution can become if it is entered consciously, not a breakdown, not a midlife crisis to be managed and recovered from, but the death and birth that the psyche was always moving toward. The initiatory passage that cultures in every era built their deepest rituals around because they understood something modern psychology is only slowly recovering, that the human being who has not been twice born is in some crucial sense incomplete, that there are dimensions of the psyche that cannot be accessed without the willingness to let the first self go. The wounded healer archetype that Jung drew from the figure of Chiron in Greek mythology adds another layer to this. Chiron the centaur was wounded by a poisoned arrow. The wound could not be healed, but it was precisely the unhealing wound that gave him his gifts as a healer of others. He could reach those in suffering not despite his wound, but because of it, because he had been in the place they were in and had not turned away from it. The person who has genuinely undergone the persona's dissolution and sat in the Nigredo has something they cannot have acquired any other way, a capacity for presence with suffering that the well-defended person simply does not possess, not because they are superior, but because they have been somewhere that teaches what no instruction can teach. They have been in the dark long enough to know it is not the end. What does this look like in ordinary life? In a life that has no mythological framing around it, in the life of a person in their 40s or 50s or 60s, sitting in a house that represents everything they worked for, feeling a distance from themselves they cannot name. It looks like this. It looks like performing competence while privately wondering if you have ever actually known what you were doing. It looks like maintaining a marriage or ending one and feeling strangely similar in either case. It looks like achieving something you spent years pursuing and standing at the achievement, feeling not fulfilled, but somehow more hollow than before. It looks like being unable to sleep and not knowing why. Like suddenly finding the social roles that used to feel comfortable now feel like clothing that no longer fits. Like the conversations that used to feel sufficient now feel completely insufficient in a way you cannot explain to anyone without sounding ungrateful. These are not signs that something has gone wrong. These are signs that the self is asserting itself. Jung would recognize all of this immediately. He would not offer a solution. He was deeply suspicious of solutions in the conventional sense. He would instead ask a question that sounds almost unbearably simple until you sit with it. What does the unlived part of you want? Not what does your role require? Not what do other people need from you? Not what would be responsible or practical or appropriate? What does the part of you that the mask was built to conceal actually want from this one life? That question is not a starting point for action. It is a starting point for listening, for the kind of interior attention Jung associated with active imagination, the deliberate practice of turning toward the unconscious, not to be swept away by it, but to enter into genuine dialogue with it, to begin to hear what has been speaking underneath the performance for all these years without ever being heard. The shadow, when it is finally met directly, is almost never what the persona feared it would be. This is one of the most consistent observations across a century of Jungian clinical practice. The contents that feel most dangerous when glimpsed from the defended position of the persona are rarely monstrous in themselves. They are human. They are the ordinary needs and feelings and qualities that were simply never given permission to exist. The rage that was suppressed is often grief in disguise. The coldness that developed as self-protection is often tenderness that was wounded too many times to risk expression. The grandiosity that flickers beneath a carefully maintained humility is often genuine gift that was never allowed to be claimed. The integration of the shadow does not unleash the worst of us. It recovers the most alive of us. And what changes after genuine shadow work is not that the person becomes someone different. It is that they become more undeniably themselves. The particular quality of their presence shifts. There is less performance, less management, less of the slight delay between experience and expression that tells the body of the person speaking to you that what they are saying has passed through several filters before reaching the air. There is more arrival, more weight, more of the specific human being rather than the role the human being has been playing. Other people feel this, and the deepest irony of persona inflation is this: the mask was built to secure connection, to be acceptable, to be loved, but the persona repels the very connection it seeks because it offers the world a construction rather than a person. Real intimacy is impossible between two personas. It requires two actual human beings, and two actual human beings can only meet when both are willing to be seen without the mask. This is why the dissolution of the persona is not ultimately a loss of relationship. For those willing to remain and enter the process with you, it is the beginning of the only kind of relationship that is actually real. There is a moment Jung described in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that deserves particular attention. He described a period following his break with Freud in which his entire psychological framework, the identity he had built as a scientist, a thinker, a man who understood the mind, entered a prolonged state of dissolution. He did not know who he was without the structure of that identity. He felt himself close to the edge of something he could not name. Rather than fleeing this experience, he turned toward it. He began what became the Red Book, a decade of the deliberate engagement with the images and figures emerging from his own unconscious. Active imagination practiced at the most demanding level imaginable. A direct confrontation with his own shadow, his own anima, his own deepest psychological contents without the protection of the professional role, without the personas of the great psychologist to shield him from what was actually living in the depths of his own interior. What he produced in those years was not therapy notes. It was a record of a genuine psychological initiation, the dissolution of a first identity, and the laborious construction not of a replacement, but of a more authentic invitation to the totality of who he was. He emerged from that period with the framework that would occupy the rest of his life, not because he had solved the problem of psychological suffering, but because he had entered it deeply enough to understand what it was actually asking. This is the model he offered his patients, not as a prescription, not as a template to be reproduced, but as evidence that the descent into the nigrido was survivable, that the dissolution of the persona did not mean the end of a person, that something waited at the bottom of that darkness that was worth the unbearable difficulty of the descent. The enantiodromia, another concept Jung borrowed and deepened, originally from Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, who observed that all things contain within themselves their opposite, and that any force taken to its extreme will eventually and inevitably transform into its opposite. Jung applied this to the persona with devastating precision. The person who has constructed the most airtight mask does not simply continue forever in controlled performance. The greater the rigidity, the more violent the eventual reversal. The man who has been strong for everyone for decades does not gradually soften. He collapses. The woman who has been endlessly accommodating does not slowly learn to set boundaries. She reaches a moment of total refusal. The psyche does not tolerate permanent asymmetry. What has been suppressed accumulates energy, and when that energy finally exceeds the persona's capacity to contain it, the reversal is total. This is the psychological mechanism beneath what the culture calls breakdowns, what the medical system calls depressive episodes, what the person living through it experiences as having been ambushed by a self they did not know they contained. Jung did not see this as catastrophe. He saw it as the psyche's last resort, the final insistence of what is real when every more gradual invitation has been refused. The enantiodromia is not punishment. It is the self refusing to be permanently denied. If you are in the middle of this now, if the life you built is cracking and the person you have been performing is no longer performing, and something in you is both terrified and quietly relieved, know this. You are not falling apart. You are falling through. The difference is not semantic. Falling apart is random destruction. Falling through is directed descent. It has a bottom. It has a far side. It has a purpose that will only be visible from the other side of it, but that does not make the purpose any less real. Jung spent his entire professional life in the presence of people falling through. People who arrived at his door convinced that they were disintegrating and discovered over time that what was disintegrating was not them. It was the construction that had prevented them from ever fully arriving. The persona cracks. The shadow rises to meet the light. The negredo does its terrible necessary work, and in the space that is left, in the cleared space where the performance used to be, the self begins to speak in its actual voice, not louder than before, but more unmistakably, because it is real. The person who has moved through this process, who has met the shadow and not fled, who has allowed the persona to return to its proper function as a useful tool rather than a total identity, who has begun even partially the long work of individuation, carries something that cannot be performed, a quality of presence that is not the result of confidence as the world usually defines it. It is the quality of a person who no longer needs the audience's applause to know that they exist, who has met enough of their own interior darkness to stop fearing it in others, who has sufficient relationship with the unlived parts of themselves to no longer require everyone around them to validate the parts they have chosen to display. This is what Jung called psychological maturity, not the absence of difficulty, not the achievement of some stable and untroubled state, but the capacity to be present to the full range of what is actually happening in the interior without immediately reaching to manage or perform or resolve it. It is the capacity to be a human being rather than a human performance, and it is available to you, not easily, not quickly, not without the willingness to sit in darkness that your entire social world may be actively encouraging you to avoid, but available. The most precise thing Carl Jung ever said about the mask was not a clinical observation. It was almost a plea. He wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to perform successfully, not to maintain the construction indefinitely, not to earn the world's recognition for a role you invented in childhood, to survive an environment that could not hold the fullness of who you were, the privilege of a lifetime to become who you truly are. The mask is not your enemy. It was your intelligence. It was your protection. It served you in ways that deserve genuine acknowledgement before it is asked to step aside. But it is not you, and somewhere underneath it, underneath the years of careful assembly, underneath the rewards and the recognition and the exhausting maintenance of the construction, the actual person is still there, waiting with the patience that only the very real can sustain, waiting for the performance to end, waiting seen for you to come home. If something in this reached a part of you that does not usually get reached, that is the self recognizing itself. Subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone still behind the mask. Leave in the comments the moment you first realized the person you were presenting to the world was not entirely you. These observations matter. They're not small. They are the beginning of the most significant work a human being can undertake. Tomorrow we go deeper. The next descent is already waiting.